Chapter 22 The Egg Once again Silverside was in turmoil. All was confusion. Who should he believe? He wished only to evade the dilemma. He metamorphosed, escaping back to the relative peace of his wolfish childhood, back to the days when Life Crier had guided him into the life of the pack on the wolf planet. Thus, mid-morning found Silverside imprinted on the wolf-like female Kenai, trotting along an animal trail far from the robot city. As she had the night before, she spent the late morning and early afternoon exploring the vast forest of repose, its trails, brooks, rivers, and lakes that lay within 10 kilometers of the city. Monitoring the field lines of Oysterworld's natural magnetism kept her oriented during her aimless roving, so that as the morning waned she began to zero in on the dome without dwelling on what she was going to do when she got there. In the early afternoon she came to the edge of the forest opposite the mirage-like transparency that concealed the robot city. She sat down on her haunches and stared at the dome with unseeing eyes, mulling over, as she had all morning, what Neronius and then Sarko had told her. She could not escape the essential validity of Sarko's assessment of Neronius, a self-centered, paranoid psychopath, nor could she any longer ignore Sinapo's directive to serve Miss Ariel, and the feeling that this could best be done in the male imprint of Jacob Winterson, who was already serving Miss Ariel with apparently great efficiency, and to her obvious satisfaction. The Jacob imprint would help, but it was still not clear exactly how she could best serve Miss Ariel. The physics Neronius had expounded had only confused her, offering information that conflicted with her earlier knowledge of space and time. He had not clarified the physics, but had instead muddied it, and left Silverside worse off than she had been before. The new information was useless, and worse than useless in the confusion it created about the physics she had once known. As she sat there in the quiet heat of the afternoon, studying the dome and trying to make sense of the aborted discussion with Neronius, she gradually became aware of a faint humming off to her left, nearer the dome but deeper in the forest. When the sound finally broke through her reverie, she rose and trotted along an animal path that led in the general direction of the hum. The path led past the hum, and when Silverside recognized that she had passed the point of closest approach, she started through the vegetation, heading directly for the sound. Although the ground was covered in that area, the cover was not dense, and she had no difficulty weaving through the shrubbery. As the hum grew steadily louder, she almost ran into its source as she came around a tall bush covered with pink blossoms. She recognized the source instantly. It was a 2-meter sphere, just as hers had been, and the duodecahedral structure of the coarse silvery cells of its skin, dulled by the heat of passage through Oysterworld's atmosphere, told her instantly it was an egg similar to her own. It lay atop the crushed base of 2 bushes, framed by pink flowers set in green foliage which, in close proximity to the foreign surface, was now seared and wilted by the heat the egg had exuded earlier. It was now almost cool to the touch, almost ready for hatching, and it came to her then what she must do. She kept the Kenai form to speed her dash through the thin shrubbery of the forest, but when she came to the plain, she began the transformation to the Jacob imprint, stopping only long as she ran along the wall of the dome. She completed the transformation to the masculine Jacob form well before he reached the opening on the north side. As Silverside approached the opening, Wooler 9 called to him from a small runabout parked near the west edge. I get no response from you on the comlink, Jacob. I am Silverside, he said as he hopped into the passenger seat. Take me to Miss Ariel Welsh. Wooler 9 started the runabout, turned into the near southbound lane of Main Street, and proceeded rapidly down the street in the direction of the compass tower. I have instructions to take you to Master Derrick at once, Silverside. Where is Miss Ariel? Silverside asked. At the apartment. Good, then we are proceeding in the right direction. Yes, Master Derrick is working at the mainframe, which is currently on the 2nd undergrowth level of the compass tower. When they came abreast of the apartment, Silverside jumped out. Wooler 9 braked the runabout to a halt, but remained seated. "I must take you to Master Derrick," Buller 9 called to Silverside's back. "Later," Silverside called over his shoulder as he ran into the building. He took the stairs 3 at a time and burst into the apartment. Ariel was sitting at the dining table reading a computer printout. The table was strewn with piles of computer output. Jacob was thumbing through the piles, apparently hunting for the next printout she would need. Silverside took in the scene, picked Ariel up, cradled her in his arms like a fragile baby, dashed out the door, down the stairs, and past Buller 9, who was running toward the apartment from the runabout. Ariel had time to scream only once before she was deposited in the runabout. As she was being gently scooped up, she had screamed, "Jacob!" with a Doppler modulation that trailed off like the whistle of a passing train. Jacob Winterson had responded with the millisecond speed characteristic of Dr. Han Fastolf's humaniform robots, but that speed was no match for the microseconds it took for all of Silverside's motions, save for the brisk but gentle acceleration when he picked up Ariel and started toward the door. He and Ariel were speeding away from the apartment building in the runabout as Jacob came pounding out of the apartment past Buller 9. Ariel's first scream had ended as she was being deposited in the runabout. Her next scream was delivered in the interrogative mode as they pulled away from the apartment. "What are you doing?" she shrieked with an intensity that rattled Silverside's auricular diaphragms, akin to eardrums. "There was no time to explain, Miss Ariel," Silverside shouted about the wind noise. "I need your presence urgently." Jacob raced after them down Main Street, but was soon left behind as Silverside accelerated the small runabout to its maximum speed, weaving in and out of the traffic and avoiding an accident by the adeptness of the city central computer. "Stop, you maniac!" Ariel screamed. "Stop now!" Silverside slowed the runabout noticeably, and then promptly sped up again. Consideration of his new knowledge of the laws of humanics humans were compelled to please themselves overrode his own second law output robots must obey human orders. He knew that when Ariel had finally considered all the facts, after the fact, she would be pleased and would approve what he was doing. "You are in no danger, Miss Ariel, but I cannot obey that order because of the overriding nature of the present situation, which demands your presence at the birthing of," and he added lamely, still shouting, "of what I cannot be sure." At that the shout died away as he said, "I can only hope." Then Ariel, sobbing and screaming incoherently, beat on him with her hands clenched into small hard fists, beat on his shoulder first, and then finally, in desperation, beat on his head. But he felt nothing in the intensity of his purpose. "You must stop that, Miss Ariel," he shouted. "You will hurt yourself." And the calm way he shouted that above the sound of the rushing air and the obvious lack of effort her effort was having must have calmed her, for she finally stopped and slumped down in the seat, seemingly exhausted, her hysteria spent. They emerged from the opening, and Silverside skidded the runabout in a sharp left turn to take him down the side of the dome. "You must understand what is taking place," he shouted. "It is very important for me, to the new foundling, even to you, Miss Ariel, for I wish her to serve you well." Ariel said nothing. She sat beside him like a limp doll. "Another like me is being born. The egg lies in the forest even now, ready to hatch. She must have a proper model, a human female, so that she does not come into being confused. Her imprint misguided as mine was. You must be there to guide her into this strange world. Do you understand what I am saying, Miss Ariel?" Ariel still said nothing, but she had straightened a little in the seat, perhaps because the slump in the bouncing runabout was more uncomfortable than the sit-up straight. "You will not be harmed, Miss Ariel. After it's all over, when you will think back on it, you will be glad you came. I know you will. You will be pleased with me. The laws of humanics will guide you." That seemed to comfort Silverside. The laws of humanics was working on the effects of his own laws, regulating their relative potential to something that was less uncomfortable. He was doing something that he knew was going to please Ariel, even though she was, perhaps, not pleased at the moment. When they arrived at the forest, he braked to a halt, jumped out, and opened the door for Ariel. She got out calmly. She must have thought about what he had been shouting at her, for she didn't object when he gently took her hand to help her from the car. That gave him confidence that she would follow him without being forced, and he let go of her hand and started into the woods. She stayed close behind him for the short, hurried walk it took to reach the egg. Silverside guided Ariel gently until she stood 2 meters from the egg, directly in front of the hatch, and then he left her there and hid behind the pink-flowered bush behind her. The hatch began to open with a soft grinding sound. Silverside could look through the lower branches of the tall bush, past Ariel's right side, and see the hatch for himself. A silvery gray, amorphous mass heaved itself above the bottom of the hatch, and formed, in that part of its mass that hung over the edge of the opening, a shiny, multifaceted, grayish-green orb that it rotated slowly around, much like an eye rotating in its socket, as though it were surveying the entire landscape. The inspection narrowed then and stared at Ariel's feet. The orb slowly scanned up until it was gazing at her head. With that inspection completed, the blob elongated and pulled itself to the hatch, as though it were one large muscle, like the foot of a huge snail. It slithered out of the hatch, coming to rest on the ground in front of Ariel like a thick pancake, with the orb still intact in the center. The facets of the orb slowly disappeared, absorbed into a grayish-green ring surrounding a black pupil, while the bulk of the orb turned white. A spherical mass the size of a small bowling ball began to rise from the pancake, lifting the eye, for it was clearly that now, and the second eye took shape, forming the first aspects of a face. Slowly then, heads, shoulders, arms, breast-mounted chest, hips and buttocks and legs all reared up out of the puddle until there was no puddle left, the last sucked up into a pair of shapely ankles and feet, and a silvery likeness of Ariel stood before Ariel. Silverside stepped from behind the bush then, and silently inspected the new arrival. Ariel had stood transfixed, mute and motionless during the whole process. Now Silverside spoke up, proudly christening this delightful new creation. "You are the female, Eve Silverside." And after allowing a moment for that to sink into both Ariel and Eve, he spoke again, triumphantly, feeling as though he had found his true identity at last. "And I am the male, Adam Silverside." And they stood like that, no one saying anything, and then the sound of Jacob's voice came to them in the sound of feet pounding the ground. "Miss Ariel, where are you?" And then the pounding stopped, and they could hear him thrashing through the shrubbery. "Miss Ariel!" he kept calling, coming closer and closer. "Here, Jacob!" Ariel called. Chapter 23. A Final Imprint. After the excitement of Eve's birth, and the brief period it took for Eve to become properly functional and subservient to Ariel under Adam's guidance, everything seemed to fall into place except for the uncertainty of how that enigmatic event could have taken place. To discover Adam Silverside on an alien midwife the birth of another of the creatures was something altogether different. It raised so many questions, with the degree of involvement of the erratic Dr. Avery heading the list. When they finally put those unanswerable questions behind them, and turned instead to the creative work that confronted them, they found that the task, though difficult, was not as difficult as they had supposed it to be. The farm programming that was used on the planet Robot City was intact in Pearl City's computer files, ready for use should the need arise. What Ariel had merely fantasized and hoped was a capacity for leadership proved in reality to be a genuine ability to lead. And what was even more amazing, Derek readily relinquished his nominal authority and bowed to her decisions in the construction of the farms and their associated terminal facilities. Initially, one of Ariel's first decisions did not have the whole-hearted endorsement of either Derek or Woolruff, although they later conceded that she was right. They all agreed that they needed an 8th supervisor robot to oversee the planet-wide farm operation. But neither Derek nor Woolruff agreed initially with the form Ariel specified for the supervisor. Adamantly, nor with the name she chose for that robot, Wheeler. To them it made no sense to name a farmer after the 20th century space-time physicist John Archibald Wheeler. To her it made perfect sense, for both were as close to nature as a being can get, the farmer in a concrete practical sense, the physicist in an abstract symbolic sense. She'd been studying space-time physics, trying to understand the node compensator. Her mind at that time was much filled with the heroic personalities of physics. And in her mind, Wheeler's name described his nomadic lifestyle that took him wheeling far and wide over the surface of the planet in pursuit of his supervisory function, for she insisted that he have the form of a Ceremon. Woolruff and Derrick later conceded that perhaps that was the proper form, because it harmonized with the job in the world so beautifully, but it was difficult at first for them to think of a supervisor in any but humanoid shape. She made Wheeler smaller than a Ceremon, so as not to intimidate the aliens, but far larger than any of the other native flyers, so that the Ceremons would not mistake him, at a distance, for a natural denizen of their world. She had insisted, too, that his robotic laws recognized Ceremons with all the weight ordinarily reserved for humans, and that Derrick revised the programming of the other supervisors to defer to Wheeler in matters dealing with Oysterworld and the Ceremons. The problem that Seeds had been worrying Ariel almost from the time she had hit on the idea of a farm world, but she found that there had been no need to worry. Seeds for a variety of crops to match the farm programs had been carried during the initial migration to Oysterworld, and were stored in labeled bins that were indexed in the programs. There was no need to get seeds from Aurora. With Woolruff's advice, to make the overall mosaic of the farm operation as benign as possible, weather-wise, they interspersed the truck gardens and orchard among the fields of wheat, oats, barley, and several other grains, and among large fields of cotton, a commodity that had never been matched for all-around adaptation to the human dermal ecology. And to minimize the upset to the planet's ecology, she further advised that they leave interspaced among their new plants an equal strand of the native grass that had covered the plain when they first arrived. In that first experiment they decided to limit themselves to plant products. The production of wool, milk, and meat, and animal husbandry in general seemed less harmonious with robotic labor than the cultivation of non-sentient plant life. Irrigation, the Dart farmer's primary worry, was not a problem on Oysterworld. Regulated rainfall was an integral part of the Ceremion's weather control system. They had recognized the need of natural vegetation long before they met humans. The terminal facilities were built above the main street access and were patterned after those in Aurora, modified to fit the special conditions demanded by the configuration of the opening in the dome. All vessels arriving and departing from an array of oval openings that included configurations suitable for all designs of shuttle and small cargo vessels then known, interstellar and otherwise. The large interstellar transports would be surfaced in orbit by smaller shuttles that could fit through the dome's opening. During this exhilarating period of leadership, Ariel experienced only one apprehension and one disturbance worth recording. The apprehension had to do with Neronius and Sinapo's warning. It was one thing to deal with insane humans. It was another thing, a good bit more unsettling, to have an irrational alien floating around overhead, toting compressed hydrogen in close proximity to conserve oxygen. Neither she nor Derrick had been able to get anything out of Adam Silverside concerning what had happened between him and Neronius. He had pleaded third law interference with the second law imperative whenever they tried. They did not insist, for fear what he called interference might be more seriously harmful to his postronic stability. Else why would he have claimed interference at all? She resolved to have Eve work on him when it seemed propitious. The disturbance was of a fairly major nature, not so much from its intensity as from its low grade, continual irritation, her irritation with Adam Silverside. That finally came to a head on a day when things had not gone well, and the little irritations had mounted into raw abrasions. She and Derrick, trying to bring some tranquillity into the day, were chatting quietly in mid-evening after dinner, just after the two of them on the balcony again. It was where they went to escape, inconsiderately leaving Woolruff in the company of the four robots. After a while they had lapsed into silence, and Ariel's thoughts returned to Adam Silverside. She had given him 2 sets of Jacob's clothes, distinctive sets that let her quickly identify him as Adam and not Jacob. She supposed she knew now what Jacob looked like under his clothes, for Adam Silverside, with visual recordings of Jacob and library recordings of humans, had carried his imprint to very fine detail indeed, and she'd observed the details of that imprint the day of Eve's birth, when Adam had come charging into the apartment naked and carried her away. Ariel broke the silence. "Was Adam's imprint on you less realistic than his current imprint on Jacob?" she asked Derek. "Yes, more or less the same as Eve's imprint on you," Derek said. Eve would never need clothes. Though an aerial imprint, she was not fashioned with the fine attention to detail Adam had used on Jacob. Eve was merely a silvery organometallic robot. "How would he react, do you think, if I asked him to go back to that one?" "You'd no longer be Miss Ariel, for one thing. It would probably be Master Derek again." "Eve and Jacob are quite enough. But how would he behave? Would he be the wild one again?" "I don't really know. He's certainly been steady these past few weeks. If it weren't for his quiet air of superiority, a condition of his muscles, I believe, I'd say he's achieved a state of agreeable servitude. It's the muscles that bother me. No, not just the muscles, his whole appearance." "Reminds you too much of Jacob?" "Yes, but more the fact that he is otherwise so little like Jacob. It's the contrast that irritates me. Do you mind if I ask him to imprint back on you?" "No. It would be another interesting experiment in robotics." No better time than now, then." She got up and went inside. Mandelbrot and Jacob were in the two niches. Adam and Eve were currently standing rigidly by the door, one to each side. Woolruff was curled up on the couch, watching a taped hyperwave drama. Ariel had expected Derek to come in with her. She could have used her moral support on this one, but she was too proud to ask. She walked over to Adam. "Would it upset your posttraumatic greatly if I asked you to return to an earlier imprint, the looser, less detailed one you done on Derek?" "Am I not giving satisfactory service, Miss Ariel?" "The service is great, Adam. I wouldn't want your behaviour in that regard to change, not in quality at least." "But then they would be serving Master Derek. Would there not be a drastic change in the quality of my service?" "A change in direction, Adam, and a change I will regret. But it should not cause a change in the quality of your service. I would expect that to remain at the same high level I've enjoyed. In fact, if you could continue to serve me directly, I would find that most gratifying." "That would not be logical, Miss Ariel." His tone was best described as haughty. "I was afraid that would be the case. In that late, do you still wish me to make such a change?" "Yes, I think it would be for the best, Adam," she said. "But would you do so in the bedroom? I find the process unsettling." "Perhaps for good reason, Miss Ariel." "Possibly, Adam, but there is little I can do about that." She rejoined Derek on the balcony as Adam went into the bedroom. "Sorry," Derek said. "I didn't see how my presence was going to make that any easier for either of you." "I suppose," Ariel said, "but he better hope he's not the wild one again." And thus we finish. I hope you've enjoyed. Sorry about the almost 2-week break unexpectedly. And I hope you all have a good weekend and a happy Easter. Bye!